Coming up, the Nets retain two key players in free agency while another's future remains uncertain. I'll dive into that after this.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Erik Slater, Brooklyn Nets beat reporter for ClutchPoints.com. Thank you for making me your first listen of the day. This show is 100% free on all those great platforms. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. And on today's show, it's a free agency episode. I'm going to be breaking down the Nets re-signing Sharpe and Ziaire Williams and what Cam Thomas's lack of a deal up to this point could signify. But starting on Day'Ron and Ziaire, the Nets got contracts done with those guys on the opening day of free agency. Contracts where if I was a Nets fan, I'd be really happy about what they were able to agree to. And that was a 2-year, $12 million deal with a team option in the second year, identical contracts for Day'Ron and Ziaire. And we saw on Sunday, the day before the start of free agency, the Nets had decisions to make on Cam Thomas, Day'Ron, and Ziaire about whether or not to tender them qualifying offers, which would make them restricted free agents as opposed to unrestricted. They tendered Cam Thomas a qualifying offer, making him a restricted free agent, but they did not with Day'Ron and Ziaire, making them unrestricted, but then swiftly re-sign them to deals. And they also, further maximize their cap space because of that, because when you tender guys qualifying offers, potential free agents, and make them restricted, they have cap holds on, which is, a number that acts as a placeholder on a team's cap sheet for free agents. And that interferes with your cap space. So whatever value that is, it takes away from your cap space. And in Day'Ron's case, it was $12 million. Zaire's case, it was $18 million. And they rescinded those. So freeing up that amount, which is about $30 million, and then signed them to contracts which equaled salaries of $12 million next year. So they opened up $18 million in additional cap space by doing that. But both of these contracts, I think, are really good deals that I think Nets fans should be happy with. And, we knew that the Nets were in an advantageous position to retain free agents, being the only team in the NBA with cap space. But that was really the most advantageous for them in the case of Cam Thomas, because teams who don't have cap space can still sign free agents using exceptions. So a large chunk of the league still has access to the $14 million non-taxpayer mid-level exceptions. They have that $14 million to use on one or multiple free agents. And because Cam Thomas's contract or his annual salary on his next deal was expected to come in over $14 million, the Nets were the only team who would be able to pay him that. But in Day'Ron and Zaire's case, guys who are probably going to sign below that $14 million amount, the Nets could face more competition for their services. And despite that, we're able to lock, in Day'Ron's case specifically, lock him down on a deal that was, quite frankly, came in below what I thought his market value was going to be. I thought that Day'Ron's contract was going to come in somewhere, in probably the $8 to $12 million range, the length of the contract, maybe 2 to 3 years. And the Nets were able to get him 2 years, $12 million. And with what Day'Ron showed last year, I think that's a real bargain and a real team-friendly deal. And the fact that they were able to get him on that number with a team option in the second year, I'm somewhat surprised by that based on, what Day'Ron did last season. If we look at Day'Ron's numbers, he was at 8 points, 6.6 rebounds, 2 assists, 52% shooting, so a little lower field goal percentage. The other numbers all really good and only 18 minutes per game. And you look at some of what he was able to do, we know that rebounding has been his calling card since he entered the NBA. It is his elite skill, and it remained his elite skill. Last season, Day'Ron posted about an 18% offensive rebound percentage. That was the second highest among all NBA players to play at least 600 minutes. Only Steven Adams was higher. So he's an elite offensive rebounder in a game where, we're seeing with the pace of how the game is played, winning the possession battle, we saw that in these playoffs, is more important than ever. And offensive rebounding is a skill that I think it always has been valuable, but I think it's just becoming increasingly valuable in the NBA. So Day'Ron was able to do that offensively. I think he displayed some interesting, short roll playmaking, some big man, half court hub capabilities in Jordi Fernandez's offense. And then defense was really always a concern for Day'Ron. He was a bigger guy, a little bit more lumbering. He wasn't a guy who could switch on the perimeter like Nick Claxton, but if you tried to play him in the drop coverage, he really had trouble there, was kind of caught in between the ball handler and that roll man and didn't have the range or mobility to play that effectively. And that really changed this season. Day'Ron the Nets played a really aggressive pick and roll coverage. They were hedging a lot. They were switching sometimes. I think Day'Ron held up well on some of those switches, but really the hedge and recover scheme or playing some drop coverage, he was effective in all those. Opponents scored 6.7 fewer points per 100 possessions during Sharpe's minutes this past season. And that was the sixth best defensive rating swing among all centers to play over 600 minutes. So Day'Ron was really effective there. And that offensive rebounding, some of the playmaking, the defense, all of that really translated to team-wide success because Day'Ron posted a plus 13.3 net rating, which means the Nets won his minutes by 13.3 points per 100 possessions. That was the eighth best mark among all NBA players to play over 600 minutes. So really elite, advanced numbers from Day'Ron there. And I think he's a guy who cracked a rotation during his third season and then was really a full-time member this past season. I think showed some really encouraging things in regard to where his trajectory could be going. So based on all that, a 2-year, $12 million deal with a team option in the second year, I think that's a really good bargain deal for the Nets. I mean, you look at some of the other deals in free agency, like we just saw Jakob Poeltl get a 4-year, $104 million extension from the Toronto Raptors. And I think that Poeltl is, I think he's definitely a better player than Day'Ron Sharpe at this point, but is he, $20 million a year annually better than Day'Ron Sharpe? I would say no. So in that regard, I think it's a good deal for Day'Ron. And if you're looking at where he's going, with how the Nets and him could potentially be looking at his representation and the Nets front office, this is somewhat a similar trajectory to Nick Claxton. Nick Claxton, played out his rookie contract. It was a little bit different because Nick was the first pick of the second round, whereas Day'Ron was a first-round pick. So that kind of changes how the contracts go. But Nick finished his rookie contract. He signed a 2-year, $17 million contract, I think it was. He balled out during those 2 years, was in the Defensive Player of the Year running that year with KD and Kyrie, was still really good the next year after that, and then obviously signed the 4-year, $97 million contract last summer. So Day'Ron has that 2-year bridge deal after his rookie deal, and then we'll see what he can get done. If he continues to produce, he is going to be in a position potentially where he could sign with the Nets on a very more lucrative long-term deal. And touching quickly on Ziaire Williams, I think a player that was really exciting for the Nets this past season in the regard that they got him basically for free. They got him in a salary dump from the Grizzlies last summer. They actually got a second-round pick alongside him, so got compensated for taking him on. Wasn't really able to carve out a role with Memphis there. They were trying to contend with Ja Morant and Triple J and some of those guys, and Ziaire was the 10th pick in that 2021 draft and didn't develop, I think, as they hoped offensively. And with that, the opportunities kind of waned, and they were really in a situation where it was less about, a rebuilding team developing guys, and it was more about we need guys who are going to produce right now. And that really wasn't a position that Ziaire, thrived in. He was struggling somewhat, especially offensively with some of the decision-making, the three-point shooting, all that. But then he comes to the Nets, and he had his best season by far, averaged like 10 points, 6 rebounds, shot close to 35% from three on 4 or 5 attempts per game. So that's career high volume. I think did a lot of things as a point of attack defender that the Nets really liked. So, just as a guy who shot the ball well with some change in the shot form, tweaks in the mechanics, was really a spark plug defensively as a guy who was defending 94 feet, point of attack, switchable, has some of those things that the Nets want to do, Jordi Fernandez wants to do. So he's an encouraging guy. They get him back, I think a $6 million, a $12 million contract over 2 years, obviously team option in the second year. So effectively a 1-year prove-it deal. Like I would expect that team option definitely to get picked up for Day'Ron Sharpe. For Ziaire Williams, that's more of a question, but a 1-year, $6 million deal, potential to have another $6 million salary the following season for a guy like Ziaire Williams, getting to that second contract and having a deal above the minimum. I think that's a good outcome for him. And for the Nets, they have the money. They're no worse off for wear, and they can really see what they have in him and have him happy and bought into what they're doing. So Day'Ron Sharpe and Ziaire Williams, I think encouraging to get them done to get them locked in on those deals. And, in Sharpe's case, I think somewhat surprising, but Cam Thomas up to this point, I'm recording this on, Wednesday night. So we're, 2.5 days, 3 days into free agency. Cam Thomas has not yet signed a deal. I'll talk about why that might be and what it could signify after a break. But before that, I want to tell you about our friends over at Olipop. Olipop is a new kind of soda made for people who love the classic taste of soda, but want something that supports their health. With just 2 to 5 grams of sugar and 9 grams of prebiotic fiber in every can, Olipop is reimagining soda in a way that's better for your gut. Guys, we've all drank regular soda and we all know that they're loaded with sugar, like 39 grams in a regular Coke or 44 grams in an orange Fanta. Olipop flips that script with just a fraction of the sugar, no artificial sweeteners, and gut-friendly ingredients like OliSmart, a blend shown to support digestive and overall health. It's soda that tastes like the real thing, but actually does something good for your body. Guys, what flavor am I trying first when I get Olipop? Maybe it's their cherry cola, their classic grape, or maybe even Dr. Goodwin, their Dr. Pepper dupe. It feels so great cracking open a soda that actually supports your gut health with Olipop's prebiotic blend that's going to leave you feeling great after you drink it. Get a free can of Olipop. Just buy any 2 cans in the store and they'll reimburse you for one. Head to drinkolipop.com/LockedOnNBA to claim your free can and find Olipop near you. That's drinkolipop.com/LockedOnNBA. Coming back from the break on today's Locked On Nets episode of Free Agency Edition, just talked about Sharpe and Ziaire Williams and the deals they got done, but the Nets' most significant free agent, Cam Thomas, has yet to get a deal done. We're about 2, almost 3 days into free agency, and we haven't really heard much on Cam's contract. I said at the top of the show, the Nets did extend Cam his $6 million qualifying offer, making him a restricted free agent. Whereas with Day'Ron and Ziaire, they rescinded that, making them unrestricted, but signed them right away. So they had, it seemed like, negotiated, ready, done with Day'Ron Sharpe and Ziaire Williams. So those breaking even before the start of free agency. In Cam Thomas's case, he's a restricted free agent, and there's been no news of a deal yet. There's really hasn't been, a peep about what's going on with the Nets and Cam Thomas. Nets obviously keep things really close to the vest in terms of the draft, trades, free agency, all of it. So, it's interesting that Cam hasn't gotten the deal done yet. And I think there's a number of reasons for that. The first being, if I think they had, obviously, like if they were on the same page and they had things negotiated, you would think that this deal would have been announced. So if they aren't on the same page, Cam could be testing the waters of free agency, seeing what he could get. Nets could be in a position where they couldn't agree on something and they said, Cam, go see what you can get, come back to us. Maybe we'll have an offer sheet we have to match, because as a restricted free agent, the Nets have the right to match any offer sheet made to Cam. So maybe they said, hey, go out, see what you can get, come back, we'll match it, or maybe we'll exceed it. But, that would be kind of an interesting situation for them to be in, because as I said at the top, there's really nobody who can pay Cam Thomas. I mean, there are some teams who still have access to the non-taxpayer mid-level exception, which is $14 million. But I think we all expected Cam's annual salary to come in above that. I've written in numerous articles that I talked to, just people around the league who were somewhat speculating, but based on market value and what they expected they've seen with other people, they said they expected Cam's annual salary on his next deal to come in somewhere between 20 and 25 million. It'd probably be a shorter term deal, but between that 20 and 25, and with the non-taxpayer mid-level exception being $14 million, the Nets are the only team who can pay him above that. So if he's going out and testing the waters of free agency, the most he can get is, $14 million a year. And to be honest, I'm not sure how many teams are dying to spend that mid-level exception on Cam Thomas. A lot of those teams who are going to be using that mid-level exceptions are teams who, are trying to contend right now. They're trying to add to their roster around the margins, already have some star guys in place. And I'm not sure if Cam Thomas is the guy that they'd be willing to spend that on. Even if they did, the Nets would be able to match it or exceed it. So the Cam testing the free agency waters, it's definitely a possibility. That could be what's going on right now. But the Nets are the only team who could pay him what his perceived, market value would be in a normal year. This is abnormal because the Nets are the only team with cap space. But another, potential reason that this deal maybe didn't get done yet is the Nets still have $17 million left in cap space. They obviously took Terrence Mann in as a salary dump on, last Tuesday before the draft. So that ate into a little bit of their cap space. And then on Monday, they traded for Michael Porter Jr., which further ate into their cap space. So they have $17 million left, and they could be looking at ways that they could use that remaining cap space, whether in salary dumps or other free agents, because the Nets have Cam Thomas's bird rights, so they can exceed the cap to re-sign him. They can go over the cap, so they could theoretically spend that $17 million in cap space and then exceed the cap to re-sign Cam Thomas on top of that, which would obviously mean, some luxury tax, more payments for Joe Tsai. But they could also just sign Cam into that $17 million of cap space without going over it. So it could be a situation where the Nets are seeking opportunities to, utilize the remaining cap space, whether it be in more salary dumps. Maybe there's some veteran or younger value guys they think they can bring in free agency. And if they can get outcomes that they want and things that are enticing to them using that cap space, they'll use it and then exceed the cap afterward to re-sign Cam Thomas. But if they can't, maybe they just sign Cam Thomas into that cap space because there's not any salary dumps or free agents or anything along those lines that are worth their while. So that's a couple different ways that you could look at this. The Nets and Cam Thomas not having this deal done. I do think that, the Nets they've been busy. Like, they've had a lot of orders of business. They've had the draft, obviously. Then we got towards free agency. They signed, I said Sharpe and Ziaire, and they traded for Michael Porter Jr. But you'd think that Cam would be a top priority. So him not having a deal up to this point, it doesn't mean that, there could be a deal in place and the Nets could just be like looking at that cap space and looking at how they're going to, fill up their books and all that. But there also could be, something where maybe Cam and the Nets aren't, necessarily close on what they think, which wouldn't be all that surprising given the fact that, Cam obviously has, some ideas about who he is as a player. He's an extremely talented guy. I talked to him, at the end of the season after he was ruled out for the year with that third hamstring strain. And he told me, he said he wanted to be back with the Nets. And he also said that when he's played, he feels like he's been one of the best guards in the league. And I said, leading up to free agency, that it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out. So I assumed if Cam thinks that he was one of the best guards in the league when he's been given opportunities, that he's going to want to be paid, not like a superstar best guard in the league necessarily type player, but it's like some of the other guys we've seen. Like, we've seen guards who have been compared to Cam, like Jalen Green signed, a $100 million contract over 3 years. I would think Cam would probably look at that and say, if he's getting paid that, I should be getting paid that. But this is a year where the Nets are the only team with cap space, so they don't have to pay him that. There's no competition. Does that mean that they couldn't? No, but they don't have to. There's not that urgency. So the Nets not having a deal up to this point, it could be a possibility of where, Cam Thomas thinks he's worth something. The Nets don't have to pay him that. Maybe they don't think he's worth quite that much, and they're trying to negotiate and work something out. But Cam doesn't really have any leverage because there's no other teams who can offer him above that $14 million non-taxpayer mid-level exception. So I do expect Cam to be back on a deal. What do I think the terms of that deal could potentially look like? I'll touch on that after a quick break. But before that, I want to tell you about our friends over at Game Time. There's nothing like the NBA playoffs, the intensity, the buzzer beaters, the fans losing their minds. It's the kind of atmosphere you must experience live. And this year's matchups already delivered. If you want to get in next time, Game Time makes it fast and easy to get seats, even for the biggest playoff games. Prices on the app actually drop closer to tip-off. And with killer last-minute deals, panoramic seat views, and no surprise fees, Game Time is a total game changer. Look, guys, I had plenty of friends in New York City looking to get in on this Knicks playoff run. Tickets were so expensive, but they just went on the app, and Zone Deals were offering 10% off exclusive Zone Deals for the NBA playoffs. They loved that they could see their exact seat view before they bought, no surprises, and the app makes it ridiculously simple. 2 taps and you're done. Also, the NFL schedule release just dropped, and you better believe I'm already looking at my fall calendar and picking which games to hit. Game Time makes scoring NFL tickets just as easy. You'll find great seats for as low as $100 thanks to exclusive discounts. And with the Game Time guarantee, your tickets are 100% authentic, will arrive on time, and you'll always get the best price with fees included. So what you see is what you pay. If you've never used Game Time to grab NFL seats, now's the time. It's seriously a game day upgrade. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download the Game Time app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Coming back from the break, closing out today's Locked On Nets episode of Free Agency Edition, talking about Cam Thomas and his lack of an extension with the Nets 3 days into free agency. Cam is a restricted free agent. I touched on, on the prior segment, some of the reasons why maybe Cam doesn't have a deal up to this point. I would expect Cam to get a deal done with the Nets to return. And what could that look like? There's a lot of different frameworks of what that could look like. The first possibility is, which I wouldn't say is all that likely, but it is a possibility. The Nets, I said, extended Cam the $6 million qualifying offer, which made him a restricted free agent. So Cam could sign that $6 million qualifying offer, and it's just a one-year deal, after which he'd be an unrestricted free agent next summer. He could, play out that 1 year, get the $6 million, go into unrestricted free agency next season, where he, could potentially get a bigger deal with a lot more teams in the NBA having cap space. But I would think that the Nets would be able to come to agreement, even if a short-term one, that would pay Cam above that $6 million qualifying offer. And with Cam, he was a late first-round pick, this being the first, real significant payday of his NBA career and NBA, relative to NBA salaries. I would think that he'd want some security of locking something in above $6 million, because if he's on $6 million, he could get injured. He could have a terrible season. You never know. So I would think the Nets and him would be able to come to an agreement. And I've said since, into the second half of last season and approaching free agency, that I thought it would be a short-term deal. And I think that that's the most likely outcome. Like, a long-term deal is still possible. The Nets could lock him in on something where they think that he'd be of, better value down the line. It could, be a descending structure with them rebuilding. But I think it's more likely that it's a short-term deal, because when you're looking at how Cam Thomas and the Nets, their relationship, and how the Nets feel about Cam Thomas, it's well documented. Like, early on, they were rebuilding. I mean, not rebuilding. They were trying to contend alongside Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. He didn't play. That was somewhat understandable. But then he didn't play even when they traded KD and Kyrie during the second half of that season. Jacque Vaughn really kept him on the bench despite them needing scoring. So you thought if they were higher on him, he probably would have been playing during that time. But then he does crack the rotation with last season. He cracks, or his third year, he cracks the rotation. And this past season, he emerges as their leading scorer and really is the main go-to guy offensively. But at that point, the Nets didn't really have a choice. And I outlined after the draft, we look at the types of players that they targeted in the draft and the things that Sean Marks and Jordi Fernandez have been talking about that in the fallout from the draft. And it's all, high feel playmaking guys, pass first. Like, Sean Marks used the term 0.5 second basketball. You don't hold the ball, you get rid of it. That's what he said when describing some of the draft picks that they made. And also he talked about positional size, defensive versatility, guys who can guard multiple positions. So 0.5 second basketball, pass first guys, the ball not sticking, sizable, versatile defenders. None of those are really descriptors that fit Cam Thomas. So I think it's interesting to think about how Cam Thomas fits into this equation with the Nets and what they're trying to build. But having said that, I would still expect Cam to be back with the Nets, because I don't think they're going to let an asset walk out the door for nothing. That would just be bad business. So what could a contract look like? If Cam doesn't sign that qualifying offer and he wants to get some security, I would expect it to be a short-term deal, either a 1 year or a 2 year deal. And I would expect it, I said league sources told me, speculating that they thought Cam's market value would come in somewhere between 20 and 25 million. Looking at some of the deals we're seeing in free agency with how little cap space, nobody having cap space really besides the Nets, how teams have already started to use up that non-taxpayer mid-level exception with a guy like Day'Ron Sharpe only getting 2 years, 12 million. I'd expect it maybe to come in lower now than that $20 million number. It could approach that still, but maybe it's somewhere just above that mid-level exception, somewhere in that $15 to $20 million range for, I'd probably say 2 years at this point, because if it's that low of a number and it's below that $20 million mark, and Cam, I said how I think that he values himself and the confidence he has in himself, I would think that he wouldn't want to lock himself into a long-term deal at that number. He'd want to, enter free agency and, in the near future and try to potentially get more money. So I would expect it to be a 1 or a 2 year deal, somewhere like, I think $18 million might be like 16 to 18 million, somewhere in that range. So like a 2 for 34, I think that could make sense. Like, that could be the deal that we see Cam get coming in on. And that might be a lot lower than some people were expecting, but the the Nets just don't have, there's no competition for the Nets really to bring him back. And also, I think Cam's archetype, I've outlined it on prior shows, is one that a lot of teams around the league are just unsure about. So, if you're talking about teams that are going to use that mid-level exception, the full mid-level exception, which is $14 million, or teams that are going to look to go after Cam in a sign and trade deal, like I'm just not sure that there's that appetite out there. There's that interest in Cam on the market. And if the Nets are going to bring him back, I think it'll be a shorter term deal. And I think it might come in just above that mid-level exception. So that could be, like I said, a 2 for 34 or something along those lines. And we'll see. I'm recording this on Wednesday night. By the time that this is, posted in the morning, Thursday morning, there could be a deal with Cam Thomas that already broke. But up to this point, there's no deal. And that leads me to believe that this could come in a little bit lower than some people expected. And I would expect it to be a short-term deal, but I would expect Cam to be back with the Nets next season and for them to retain him and give him a little bit more of an extended runway to audition for them, show them what he can do, and see if he can fit into the vision and maybe round out some of those less polished aspects of his game, whether it's been, the playmaking and the willingness there or some of the defensive shortcomings that we've seen. So extremely talented player in Cam Thomas. I'm excited to see what happens with him, but I would expect him to be back with the Nets and have this coming season as another audition year to see if he will be a part of the Nets' long-term plans. But that does it for this free agency episode of Locked On Nets. Thank you to all of you for tuning in and supporting the show. I really appreciate it. If you don't already, make sure to subscribe to Locked On Nets wherever you get your podcasts, whether Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Also, hit up my YouTube channel, subscribe there. Be sure to like, comment, let me know what you think of Sharpe and Ziaire's deal. Let me know what you think about Cam not having a deal yet, or projections for what his deal could look like. Excited to hear from all you guys on that. But I'll be back tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.